Thank you, Professor Zorelli, for that introduction, and good morning to everyone. It's a privilege to speak to such a distinguished international audience, and I'm very thankful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. I represent the Commonwealth of Learning, and our motto is Learning for Development. Yesterday, Professor Zorelli said that half this conference is from Malaysia, USA, Australia, Japan, and Taiwan. Some of these countries are not from the Commonwealth, and in others we are not very active, especially Australia. Is towards sustainable OER, a perspective from the Global South, and you know Global South is the politically correct way of saying developing world. And I have prepared this presentation jointly with my colleagues, Dr. Balasubramaniam and Dr. Abdul Rahman Umar. I plan to look at these 6 different areas in my presentation. First, to give you briefly the context of the developing world, what are the priorities there. Then to look at what are OER. Third, does the hype match the hope that surrounds OERs? Then I will look at the Commonwealth of Learning experience and try to draw some of the lessons from what we have learned and share them with you. Looking at sustainability, and finally, what role can various stakeholders play, especially at the policy level? Now, if you look at the context and you look at the growth in higher education in 5 years from 1999 to 2004, you'll notice in the last line that in the developing world, it's been 144% growth in just 5 years. You can look at East Asia and the Pacific, 179% growth. And yet, there is still a huge need. The World Bank says that if a country has to achieve sustainable economic development, the age participation rates, that is participation rates of the 18 to 24-year-olds in higher education, must be in the region of 40 to 50%. Even countries like Australia are at 32% trying to reach 40%. But in most of South Asia, the age participation rates are less than 10%, and in Africa, it's even lower, it's less than 5%. So all the governments in the developing world have these major ambitions. For example, Malaysia wants to have by this year its age participation rates up to 40%. Jamaica, which is again a Commonwealth country in the Caribbean, 30% by 2015, and India, 15% by 2012. Now, it might seem a bit modest because they already have 11%, but in sheer numbers, it's huge. Now, the demand for higher education is so great. If you look at Dhaka University, that of the 80,000 people who applied to get into higher education, only 10,000 could be accommodated in the public university system. And if you look at the public universities in Kenya, out of the 40,000 eligible people ready to enroll in higher education, only 9,000 could be accommodated. So there's a huge need. Likewise, yesterday, Professor Taylor mentioned the need for 18 million additional teachers in the world if the education for all and if the Millennium Development Goals, which is universal primary education goals, which have to be achieved by 2015, can be actually made a reality. For example, in Nigeria, from 580,000 to 706,000, the teachers have to, number has to increase by 2015. Similarly, Kenya, from 150 to 192,000, 100,000, and Bangladesh from 370 to 453,000. So it's not just higher education, it's also teacher training. And then finally, in many countries, free universal primary education has been introduced. But of all the people who are coming out of free primary education, only up to 20% will have access to secondary education. Now, where are governments going to build brick and mortar institutions for all the other 80% who need to get into secondary education? Besides, according to Keith Levin from the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, that secondary education costs more than twice as much as primary. So governments are not really going to have the money to invest in secondary education. And in any case, governments have always been constrained by the iron triangle, what Sir John Daniel calls the iron triangle, of access, quality, and cost. If you increase access, you lower quality. If you reduce cost, you reduce access, and so on. But there are ways in which this iron triangle can be configured, and perhaps, like a generation ago, it was distance education if done well. It could, through distribution of labor, sharing and pooling of expertise, and economies of scale, actually reconfigure this triangle so that access could be increased, quality could be improved, and costs could be reduced all at the same time. I think that same argument can now be used in the case of open education resources, that if we share, and if the global community comes together to share content, we can reconfigure the iron triangle of access, quality, and cost. One of the emerging issues in educational discourse today is the development and use of OERs and their potential in expanding access and improving the quality of education, particularly in the developing countries where there is a dearth of quality materials. For the purposes of this presentation, the term OER is used to refer to open content rather than open source software and tools. But first, how important is content in terms of impact on learning? Researchers at Concordia University, Montreal carried out a meta-analysis of hundreds of studies in which distance education materials students were treated in different ways. They distinguished 3 types of interaction: student content, student-student, and student-teacher. All the studies were then analyzed to find which type of interaction made the greatest difference to student performance when it was increased. The results were very significant. Increasing student content interaction had the greatest effect, followed by student-student interaction, with student-teacher interaction featuring last. So does this have any implications for the kind of teacher-centered paradigm of education that we have been following all this time? According to this study, learners' interaction with content makes the most significant impact on their performance. This highlights the importance of content and consequently of OER within the teaching learning process. So what are OER? The OER movement is only a decade old. If we take 1999 as the starting date, with Richard Barremuir's initiative at Rice University, which later became the Connections Project. OER are synonymous with OCW, Open Courseware, Open e-learning content, Open digital educational content, and Open learning resources, which is a more recent coinage. But the term OER was first used in July 2002 at a UNESCO workshop, where participants defined OER as technology-enabled open provision of educational resources for consultation, use, and adaptation by a community of users for non-commercial purposes. OER include learning objects such as lecture material, etc.